Let's talk. I think one of the big issues that our listeners would be interested in, that I'm interested in, is, there's a lot of opinions about the Russia-Ukraine. Now, obviously, there's the dominant view that, you're allowed to have, and then there are counter views, and some of them are maybe conspiracy, and then some of them have, some basis and reason. But my question is, with Russia and Ukraine, apart from, the potential of World War II, III, or nuclear threats and all these kind of things, what about just your average, Joe Blow American in terms of the supply chain issues? Ukraine produces a massive amount of fertilizer for the entire world that can make the difference, in what percentage of crops are produced, not just by Ukraine or Russia, but multiple countries all throughout the world. It could limit the harvest among farmers in multiple countries, nations all around the world by 40, 50, 60%. So what would you say in terms of the question of food shortages? Is that something that is reasonable, that actually might happen? And would it affect America? Would we actually have food shortages, or would we just have further inflation, higher grocery prices? And with all of that, what are some things that Americans, and specifically Christians, can do? Because we want to be prepared to take care of ourselves, our families, our churches, but also to be generous to those in need. What do you think?
So with regard to food shortages, we're looking at global economic issues, right? And the more macro you get in economics, the simpler the rules are, right? So what we're talking about is something called the law of supply and demand. Mm-hmm. And I always like to point out, by the way, my undergraduate degree is in economics, and I loved it. And either you love economics or you hate economics. There's no middle ground. And I guess I was one of the nerdy ones that really liked it. But they call it the law of supply and demand, the law, not the theory of supply and demand. You can't beat the law of supply and demand. It's like gravity. Okay. So when you have a shortage of anything, but food is in a special category of things that people can't live without. Right. So there's some goods like yachts. Right. And so if the supply of yachts go down, not many people are hurt by that. And not many people freak out or do something else. And there's other substitutes. Right. So you can go on a cruise ship instead of buying a yacht, or, do other things. But for food is something that people can't live without. And there aren't any good substitutes for it. Okay, so if you don't have food, it's not like you can watch it on TV or something like that. I mean, or wait until you put it off for a few months. You've got to have it. So when we talk about a shortage, what we're saying is that the supply is reduced. We have a reduced supply of whatever that good is. So in the case of a food shortage, we have less supply of food. And that all makes sense. And there's nothing particularly interesting or controversial about that. But what the law of supply and demand says is that when the supply goes down, the price goes up. There's a famous graph, and it's got an X in the middle of it, and it has to do with supply. And so when you have high supply, prices are low, right? High supply, low prices. When supply is low, prices are high. There's an inverse relationship in supply and demand, and those lines get more extreme the less able people are to find substitutes for a good.
Gotcha.
And since food is one of those goods where it's very difficult to find a substitute or impossible to find a substitute, that inverse relationship is very extreme. So as the food shortage becomes more pronounced, as the supply gets less and less, the prices spike. They go astronomical. Okay. So the first thing that people should observe about that is that food shortages will hurt lower income countries more than higher income countries. Now they're going to hurt higher income countries because a greater proportion of your budget is going to go to buy food, which means that the way you're going to handle substitutions is you're going to buy less of other things because more of your budget is consumed by foods, but you're probably not going to go without food. But in third world countries, they don't have room in their budget they can't take away from their vacation and from that new car that they're not going to buy. And other places like higher income first world countries can. They're just not going to buy food, and they're going to starve if the food shortages are bad enough. And so the people who are going to be hurt the worst by these food shortages are the, people less able to accommodate those increased prices. They won't have any choice. And so the food will go to the countries with money to pay for it. Mm-hmm. If it gets to the point where Americans are starving, then the rest of the world is going to get wiped out.
Yeah.
It's going to be starvation on a scale you've never seen before. So we're going to pay a lot more for food, and third world countries, people are going to be starving. And then the question is, are we accounting for those potential deaths in whatever calculation we're making in how we approach the Ukraine-Russia conflict? Yes. And when I say Ukraine-Russia conflict, I'm not, implying that I don't believe it's a war or whatever. That's not it. What's happening to the Ukrainian people is horrible. It needs to stop. Russia needs to get out of Ukraine. But the question is, diplomatically, politically, geopolitically, how do we, as the United States of America, respond? Should we be having our president going out and saying that Putin can't remain in office and essentially threatening regime change in Russia? And I know Biden came out recently and denied that he meant that he was calling for regime change. But the question is not what he meant. The question, the more significant question is, how did Russia take it?
Right. Not what Biden said, but what did Putin hear? And when you're talking about Putin, you're talking about a guy who is, so on the one hand, I'll say a couple things that are unpopular. Putin is a nationalist, and I prefer a nationalist to a globalist. That said, I think he's a nationalist war thug. So I don't think he's a good guy by any stretch of the imagination. Putin in some ways reminds me of Trump a little bit, that he's not the kind of guy that you want to tick off. He's desperate, and he's already been shocked by the lack of success. And you have to hand it to Ukrainians, the fact that they have held off troops that far outnumber their own. I think Putin really thought that this was going to be, they say Rome wasn't conquered in a day. Well, I think, Putin thought that Ukraine was going to be conquered in a day, or at least certain parts of it, and he's been remarkably unsuccessful with his invasion, which means you already have a guy who seems to have some problems, some insecurity, fragile, kind of problems, just his personality, his disposition. And then that coupled with situationally being unsuccessful. And then you have, he's got to report back. He's the kind of guy, it seems as though he's the kind of guy, both by disposition and circumstantially what's happening, that cannot afford to lose. He has to have some kind of win. And so if you challenge a guy like that, it's like a guy standing on a ledge. If you're trying to de-escalate the situation, and it's not just a guy standing on a ledge, threatening his own life with suicide. To make the illustration more accurate, it's a guy standing on a ledge holding two children, who would die also. And if you're at the bottom, you don't want to say, you drop those children or we'll shoot you in the head. Like, that's not your first, you know what I mean? You don't want to necessarily lead with that. Putin needs some kind of off-ramp, and you're absolutely right. Nobody. I believe in sovereign nations. I believe in Ukraine's right to defend itself. I believe that they have a right to police their borders. All the Democrats, in our nation believe that. I wish they believed it about our nation policing our borders, and everything that they believe about Ukraine, I wish they believed about America. But all that being said, I do think those are biblical principles. God sets up nations. Nations are God's idea. The nations eventually they're Jesus' inheritance. He's coming back for the nations. God appoints borders and times and all these different things. So I support Ukraine in all that regard. But liberals always think in terms of solutions, free ice cream for everyone. And that's just not the way the world works. The world typically works in terms of liberties and cost, not just solutions, but cost and concessions and those. And you're absolutely right to say there may be a cost to Ukraine in order to counter a larger cost of global starvation. Is that some of what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that we would hope that our leaders are considering the entire picture and not just teaching Putin a lesson or winning a war or whatever. The diplomats should be working full out on both sides, right? Putin's got some, and by the way, I'm an anti-communist since I was a fetus, right? So, and Putin was a former KGB czar, right? And the person I would least trust in the entire world. And I don't like communists. I don't trust them, and I don't trust Putin. But he has enunciated some legitimate grievances, right? So he doesn't want NATO in Ukraine. He doesn't want Ukraine to become a NATO country, and he doesn't want NATO military assets in Ukraine right on his border. And you know what? All of us can understand that. We wouldn't want China entering into some strategic military partnership with Mexico and moving Chinese military assets in there.
Right.
We would probably do something about that.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to put that one under the category of a legitimate grievance that Putin has. Mm-hmm. Now, he's also complained about these biolabs to the UN, which is where he's supposed to take it, right? And the UN didn't do anything. Mm-hmm. And the media first fact-checked that biolab story as false and then had to admit that it's true, because we do have biolabs in Ukraine. And you know what? Again, if China was building biolabs in Mexico, we probably wouldn't be happy about that.
Right.
Okay. So that's a legitimate grievance that Putin has. Now, are we negotiating in good faith to, reassure the Russians, hey, okay, we don't want global starvation. We will agree not to put NATO assets in Ukraine. And you know what? It was a bad idea for us to open up those biolabs. You're right. We're sorry. We're closing them. We'll never do it again. Okay. Is that on the table? And it may be, I hope that it is behind the scenes, right? I hope that it's a need to know thing, and we don't know because we don't need to know, but I'm not sensing that. Instead, I'm sensing kind of a lot of bellicose rhetoric and escalation. Yeah. Rather than, hey, let's diffuse this situation and let's help Russia get out of Ukraine as quickly as possible. But let's address some of these legitimate things that the Russians right now it seems like we just want to call the Russians evil. And there's no justification or explanation for what they're doing, when a child could see that Putin's got some legitimate issues, right? Let's deal with those issues. That's all I'm saying.
I completely agree. And I think part of the reason, so it's like, it seems, like common sense, let's diffuse the situation, not just for the sake, and diffusing the situation, just to be clear, I'm aware of liberties and costs. I'm aware of, cost benefit analysis. So I understand when I say diffuse the situation, I understand that diffusing the situation includes in that a cost to Ukraine, and perhaps an unfair cost to Ukraine. And I'm aware of that, but I'm talking about the cost to Ukraine as an American who's not in Ukraine, who won't pay that cost. And so I recognize the dilemma here, but a cost to Ukraine in order to avoid a global cost of food shortages and energy crisis and all these other, and of course the potential of outright worldwide war. And so
thermonuclear destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that seems like a pretty big deal that, even Ukraine would benefit by not having, there not being a global nuclear war. So all that being said, cost and benefits, diffusing. And my point is to say, it seems like common sense would suggest we need to diffuse here. And I wonder sometimes if, part of it, I think, Biden is senile. And I think, I think some of it really is just he doesn't know where he is and he doesn't know what he's saying. But then part of it, I also wonder is some of this intentional, right? So I think it was Chesterton that said, never attribute to malice what can be, easily explained by stupidity. But even stupidity gets things right occasionally, just by the laws of average, but when you get everything wrong and you're never right on anything ever, like the fact that Biden has never been right in 48 years of his government career on any foreign policy, then at that point, stupidity can't even explain that level of failure, and it seems as though maybe there is some kind of malice. And when I think of what the motives might be there, and of course this is speculation, I admit that, I wonder if there's maybe a hidden motive not to diffuse global tensions and what's corresponding right now between Russia and Ukraine, because if we diffuse that, then the focus has to shift back to what's going on at home, and none of it's good. And none of it, bides well for Democrats heading up to midterm election. And so I wonder if there's, a procrastination in diffusing a situation over here in order to distract people, namely American citizens, long enough to get through November at home. That's one of my thoughts, at least.
Yeah, and you're inviting me to enter into that realm of speculation.
You don't have to. I'm throwing it out there myself. You don't have to join me if you don't want to.
Yeah, there are obviously there's a lot of theories floating around, and what I found it more profitable to do, and we're not going to be able to do it this time because I have a plane waiting on me, and they just gave me the heads up
good
that it's ready. But we can do it another time, and that is, I find it much more profitable to look at what groups have incentives based on the existence of this conflict, right? And we can say, we hope that these, for example, the U.S. defense industry. Okay, so they profit. When the Congress talks about sending a $14 billion aid package to Ukraine, they're not talking about shipping them pallets of cash like the Iranians got, right? They're talking about sending them war material. Mm-hmm. And that war material is going to be purchased from U.S. defense contractors like General Electric, Raytheon, and so forth. And that's fine. And that's what they exist for, right? They're legal. They make bombs and tanks and guns and things like that. And that's fine. But we need to be witting and aware of the fact that their incentives are sort of on the opposite side of diffusing the conflict. That's
a good point.
And we hope that they do the right thing, and we hope that they make the right choices, but they're also facing counter incentives. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then we can start to look at some other groups in the current geopolitical landscape. Who are other groups that have incentives for further conflict instead of less conflict? And I think we can have a pretty productive conversation about that, because we can all agree, no matter what side you're on, that we need to reduce those negative conflicts wherever we can, or negative incentives wherever we can, right? In order to then reduce the conflict.
Wait. Real quick, before you go, do me a favor. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell so you'll be notified with all our new content as it comes out on a daily basis. And if you're willing to support this ministry, you can do so by going to rightresponseministries.com/donate. Thanks so much. God bless.